And welcome to another episode of 50 Shades and Grey, where I'm joined by one very special guest of mine, which is my brother. Hello, mate. Welcome. How are you doing?
Good. I'm all right, thanks.
So the reason why I've got my brother on here today is not that we're just keeping it in the family. I thought it'd be a really interesting viewpoint to have. He lives in New York. He's been out there, what, you've been 38 years now? 33 years. So,
Yeah.
And we both went out together back in 1990, where we travelled out to Colorado for work. And then I went to university and you came to New York with me, didn't you? You always planned to go there. So I went to New York. I went to Connecticut. I was playing football out there. So I was there for a couple of years. My brother went down to New York and then hasn't returned home since, really. So you've been there the whole time. You've had no spells back coming home.
No, none.
So basically, my brother's got married, and their situation, which is more commonplace now, I think, but at the time wasn't so. So his wife has been a career woman. My brother's career allowed him to work at home. So it made sense to them both that he would raise the children as the house husband, if you like. And his wife then continued her career at work. So pretty much the opposite to how everything else works.
Yeah.
So the reason why I wanted to speak to you today, mate, was because I know it's something that we've spoke about on this podcast a couple of times. It's come up, but I thought it'd be really good to get a male perspective because you've raised the kids right the way through from school, obviously, and done everything that most people do. How as a male have you found that experience?
I mean, multitudes. Really, I guess a big part of it has been it's just eye-opening to many, many facets of relationships and also to raising children. The cliche or the understanding that women raise children because, generally speaking, because it's somehow natural and because they have breasts. My experience when my son was born, my kids are in their 20s now, but when my son was born and we made this decision that one of us would stay at home, I really didn't know how I was going to feel about it. I didn't even know how I was going to feel about having kids. I suppose a lot of us don't. And to my great surprise and happiness, I found that I loved it. I absolutely loved it. And it's a great privilege to be able to do that. But to answer your question, it was really kind of occasionally quite shocking, the reaction I would get. And always from men, never from women. The negative reaction from men was really kind of upsetting sometimes. And then obviously you get used to it and whatnot. But there was a sense from a lot of men that I ran into that I didn't know very well usually, that if a man stays at home, he has somehow failed in a career, or he stayed home because he's useless in a sense, because that's all he can do. That is good enough. I think there's this misunderstanding about stay-at-home dads that we're all from Brooklyn and we all sit around talking about solar panels, and giving our kids mashed yeast and and it just isn't like that at all. It's a very practical, hands-on job, as most people know that have kids, and it's very demanding. It's incredibly stressful, and when it's you doing most of it, because in the early days my wife traveled a lot and we were living outside of New York at the time, in a town where we didn't know anyone. We had no social life. We literally had no friends. And I think you came over once or twice, maybe once or twice. And it was a very difficult time. And I was there always with the kids. And when you have two young kids by yourself, day after day after day, it's a lot. It's more than a job. It's just continual emotional pressure. Yeah. So in terms of what I learned, I mean, I think everybody's experience is different because all the kids are very different, yet they have different reactions. The way they interact with each other is different. Their friends are different. But there's only so much you can influence, because you have to remind yourself that no matter how well you think you're raising your kids. I mean, I knew a mother who, when the kid was 2, she refused to allow her to use the word gun. Like, you can get some absurdities like that. But eventually, your kids are going to hang out with other kids, and they are going to eat chicken nuggets, and they are going to swear, and they are going to smoke weed, and they are going to do stupid stuff, And I think that sorry, I'm branching off a bit here, but the sense of when they're young that you're going to have these perfect children, and they're going to be on this kind of train track and stay the same way their whole lives is completely wrong, completely misguided. And I think I just answered 5 questions there.
Yeah, I think
Even 4 of them you didn't ask.
I think that one of the main things, and we are generalising slightly because it's not the same situation for everybody, but a lot of men probably who are going out to work and walking out the door every day at 7 o'clock, coming back through the door at 6:30, and they are, busting their backsides in order to make a living for the family. I don't think have the appreciation of what the job that most women do, and more men these days, but I don't think they have the appreciation of how hard the actual job is, because it is full time, isn't it?
Yeah, and I wouldn't even say it's the appreciation. I think when the kids are young, the spouse generally more respects the stay-at-home parent because the responsibilities are 24/7. As they get older, they go to high school and what they're 14, 15, the responsibilities become less and less. But then the emotional responsibility becomes more. When they're babies, you're worried about their health and you're worried about getting them vaccinated and they get sick all the time and all this kind of thing. But I think what it is with the spouse, men in particular, it's a lack of comprehension as to what it is you're doing for your family. And it's that one of the main things you're doing is you're allowing your spouse to concentrate 100% on their job and nothing else. And granted, when the spouse comes home, the spouse will help out and take the kids for a while and you'll take a break and all the rest of it. But that spouse doesn't have to think about the kids during the day. He doesn't have to worry about them. He or she can come home and know that everything's taken care of. I mean, when my wife used to come out sometimes, the house was a disaster. It was. But that speaks more about me generally, rather than it does my kids. Those early years are extremely stressful for all concerned. But like I said, I think most men in particular, they lack the comprehension about what it is you're doing, the profound importance of what you're doing. And then, typically speaking, once the kids go off to college, if they do go to college, then it's like, okay, now what are you going to do?
I wanted to ask you is, now that you've done that role as a stay-at-home parent, when you hear the stories of sort of 2 people that are splitting up, stereotypical situation, the guy's at work, the woman's at home, and the guy's like, they're going to take 50% of everything that I've worked for. Do you have more sort of sympathy for the stereotypically the female in that situation than maybe you would have had before?
Yeah, complete sympathy. Because the problem with stay-at-home parents and the problem with the spouse who goes out to work is the spouse, as we were, saying, that they have no comprehension, but they also don't know how to value it, because being a stay-at-home parent has no monetary value. Not even the stay-at-home parent knows how valuable it is in a monetary sense. And so it's very hard to place it. When you think of all the various jobs that a stay-at-home parent does, from chauffeur to cooking to nurse to psychoanalyzing and so on and so forth, these are all mini jobs within the larger job itself. And all of them in the real world would command some sort of salary, but there is no fixed salary. So it's kind of in this twilight zone of job/career that suddenly ends one day, and then you're just kind of left washed up on the beach, looking around, there's no one else there. So that's the thing. is the value of it, you know, that was really, really hard to ascertain while I was doing it. But it was a real shock to me, more than anything, in the very beginning, when I first started doing it, when I first started being at home in the first couple of years, how little value was put on it, as opposed to how great a value. And if I can just tell
Yeah,
a
of
quick
course, yeah.
story, if you don't mind. We were living outside of New York for a couple of years with my wife's job transfer, and he said to me, "Oh, you have no life insurance. I'm going to send the life insurance guy around." I said, "Fine." So one summer day, the life insurance guy shows up. I'm home with the kids. They're sort of 1 and 3, and my daughter's bouncing in the little thing, you know, the bouncy thing that hangs from the ceiling, and my son is in a nappy that's hanging around his ankles, and he's like, you know, should have been changed half an hour ago, and I'm wearing like a stained wife beater shirt, and my hair's a mess. I'm unshaven, and there's a knock on the door, and it's the life insurance guy, and he's in a suit and the rest of it. He comes in, and so I just want to ask you some questions so you can get proper life insurance. I said, yeah. So he says, you lived in New York for a long time. You did any drugs? I said, no. I don't know. And he's really embarrassed, and he says, what about, you know, sexual intercourse? You know, do you have any unprotected? I said, no, nothing like that. You know, lying. But anyway, and then he says, so your wife contributes X amount, and he's literally sitting there with me. He's holding a pen in his hand. He's looking at his papers. Your wife contributes X amount. What's your contribution? So I'm like, well, you know, son's nappy's now falling off, and he's walking around, and there's trains all over the floor, and my daughters are bouncing away, and I said, yeah, I look after the kids, and I'm home with the kids. And he goes, yeah, no, I can see that, but actually, how much do you contribute? And I'm like, you know, nothing. And he says, nothing. I said, yeah, nothing at all, nothing. And so he writes, literally, contributes nothing, and then kind of underlines it, and he shook my hand, and I was sitting there, and I was in a daze, and I'm like, that's what people think. That's actually what people think. There's no monetary value to this. I contribute nothing. And I was in such a shock. I called my wife at work, and she picks up the phone immediately. And I said, I contribute nothing. And she says, yeah, I know. What do you want? And that really was the first time I thought to myself, women have gone through this fucking shit for thousands and thousands of years. This is what people think that we're doing in the grand scheme of things. And when you get to the end of that road, if you want to call it the end of the road, when the kids go off to college or they leave home or whatnot, there you are, having contributed nothing. And you now have nothing to contribute on top of it. So it's all because nobody knows how to value this stuff. Nobody's ever come up with a solution. There are no good books on raising kids, and there are certainly no good books on how to get through it and come out the other side with a plan in place. And that's what I found myself.
I think the big thing there is it's sometimes it's just an awareness. I think it's for sort of the person that goes out to work. They've got no idea what the job entails, and likewise, the person who's staying at home doing all the jobs probably hasn't got any idea of what the person going to work has got to do. And there's that sort of not a lack of communication almost, but there's that, because neither one knows what the other one's doing. There isn't any sympathy.
Yes.
Because the person going to work probably thinks, I've got to listen to all these people give me crap all day. I've then got to go out in the evening with people I don't like, pretend I like them, and have these meetings. and you get to stay at home and look after our kids, I'd much rather be doing that. Whereas the person at home, like,
well, sure, everybody says that. Everybody says that, but if you have, we were very fortunate. You and I, we had great kids, but imagine if you have two kids that have colic, where they never stop crying, and it goes on for years and years. The fuck wants to deal with that? But
oh
people
yeah,
do, and you don't want to stay at home then, do you? You don't
no,
want to stay at home then. You're out the
there was a.
door, half an
I
hour
mean,
early for work.
Zach actually had that when he was growing up. So, and I always remember this. He
Yeah.
was about 6 months old, and I had him in the front room, and it's one of those things where you think, right, you find a position where they stop crying, and you think, I've got it. This is the position, and then they
Yeah.
start crying again, and this goes on and on and on,
Yeah.
and it went on for days. But I remember
Yeah.
there was one stage of where he was crying, and like you, as a person, you were a million miles away from it, but I'd sort of. There'd been a story in the news recently at that time where someone had sort of thrown one of their children, against the wall, and it was horrific.
Yeah.
But you kind of get to that point of where
Yeah.
you think, if you're not like emotionally stable and strong, I could see how people got to that point.
Sure.
And don't get me wrong, million miles away from it myself, but
Yeah.
it was like, I can see like the lack of sleep, like you could understand it. So like you say, if you had 2 or 3 children at home, one of them had colic while the other 2 are pulling you left, right and centre, it must be like
Yeah.
awful.
Yeah. I mean, you'd be mad not to get extremely frustrated, even when you love your kids, and even when they are good kids. We all have gotten extremely frustrated, and I'm sure every stay-at-home parent can relate to this. I would have days, particularly when the kids were young and we were living and we had very few friends and very few family was around, and my wife would come in from work at the end of the day, and I'd have the 2 kids, one in each arm, and I'd just hand them to her and walk out. I'm a really patient person, and I don't have much of a temper, but I just couldn't wait till she walked in the door. I didn't say anything. I'm like, you're up. See you in about 3 hours. And I'd go for a run and then go to the pub. And then I got home, I was fine. And this didn't go on for very long. It went on for a couple of years, probably. But it's extremely difficult. And, what you're thinking then, when you have these days and these weeks and these months, is I don't get to stand by the fucking water cooler all day and talk about what I saw on TV last night, or I don't get to go for a long lunch with the boss or whatever it is, In that sense, it swings and roundabouts, because both of you are going to have tough days and both of you are going to have easy days. But it really comes back to there's a chasm of misunderstanding between the 2 different roles. And as the roles change, the one that changes the most is the parents. And so the stay-at-home parent, and the stay-at-home parent is expected to adjust accordingly to those changes, in the sense of starting to bring in money. And then, ridiculously, at some point, they're expected to bring in close to the same amount of money, having been out of the workforce effectively for 15 years. So it's I do want to stress that I felt it was a great privilege to be able to do this when I did it. And I learned an awful lot about people, and I became a much more compassionate person. But the biggest thing I learned was how little appreciation women have had, and how what most women, most men that stay at home do the job really well. But it's something that really needs to be sort of brought out, I think, so that going into it, whoever's staying at home is given not just credit and credibility, but respect.
But a lot of men probably who are going out to work and walking out the door every day at 7 o'clock, coming back through the door at 6:30, and they are, busting their backsides in order to make a living for the family. I don't think have the appreciation of what the job that most women do, and more men these days, but I don't think they have the appreciation of how hard the actual job is, because it is full time, isn't it?
Yeah, and I wouldn't even say it's the appreciation. I think when the kids are young, the spouse generally more respects the stay-at-home parent because the responsibilities are 24/7. As they get older, they go to high school and what they're 14, 15, the responsibilities become less and less. But then the emotional responsibility becomes more. When they're babies, you're worried about their health and you're worried about getting them vaccinated and they get sick all the time and all this kind of thing. But I think what it is with the spouse, men in particular, it's a lack of comprehension as to what it is you're doing for your family. It's one of the main things you're doing is you're allowing your spouse to concentrate 100% on their job and nothing else. And granted, when the spouse comes home, the spouse will help out and take the kids for a while and you take a break and all the rest of it. That spouse doesn't have to think about the kids during the day. He doesn't have to worry about them. He or she can come home and know that everything's taken care of. I mean, when my wife used to come out sometimes, the house was a disaster. It was. But that's speaks more about me generally rather than it does my kids. And, it was those early years are extremely stressful for all concerned. But like I said, I think most men in particular, they lack the comprehension about what it is you're doing, the profound importance of what you're doing. And then typically speaking, once the kids go off to college, if they do go to college, then it's like, okay, now what are you going to do? And yeah.
So that was the next bit that I wanted to get you onto, because that was sort of the bulk of what I wanted to talk about today. Because so after you've invested all of this time and you've worried about them sort of as babies, and then you worry about them after school, then you worry about where they're going, then they they get to that age where you're always needed. I know that, but you're not at the forefront of everything anymore. So what was that?
No.
What was that like for you? I mean, it's called sort of empty nest syndrome. But what
Right.
did you sort of go through that? How was that from your point of view?
I mean, for most parents, American parents, the day that your kids go off to college and you drop them off is one of the most emotional days you'll ever have, because they have, as the cliche goes, they've flown the nest. But I think most people that stay home, at least in New York, they kind of had a backup plan, myself included, for when the kids do leave. And, you hope to have a kind of career, which you would have started on years and years ago. And
is there a sort of a sense of now, like almost like a hole in your life once the kids had gone?
Oh yeah, sorry, you asked me about that. Yeah, yeah, definitely. There was, my daughter moved to a different town and a different city in the States, and I miss her more than I ever have. Obviously, the feelings don't go away, even though once your kids are grown, they speak to you like an adult, which is a bit odd at first, and they make fun of you, like in a really kind of sophisticated way, which is odd at first, and they say things to you that you had said to them when they were kids to sort of chastise you. That was the funny thing. But there was a sense that my job is done when the kids went off to college. And even though I would visit them a lot, well, we both would visit them a lot, rather. Yeah, there was a big hole, and my writing was supposed to take that hole, or take that place of them, and it didn't work, unfortunately. Not to be successful was as difficult for me as the kids leaving.
Did you feel less pressure when on sort of you having a career when you was looking after the kids as such, because you was already doing a job and your writing was almost like a second job, if you like? So once the kids had gone, did you feel like that was your primary career and that put more pressure on it?
I did. So them leaving obviously gave me more time, but I had always found the time to do it, and I was just left with this kind of sense of, well, shit, now what?
Because I was reading the other day that, and obviously through the questions that I get and the comments that I get through Instagram and through YouTube as well, is that when this happens to a lot of women in their 40s, that's a prominent time of where they can then start looking at their own relationships and realizing that themselves and their partners have gone in completely different directions, because one's been so busy working and the other one's been just taking care of the kids. And then once the kids have gone, they're then sort of there together thinking, right, we either get to know each other again, or by that stage, they're very different people. Have you found that happens a lot sort of in the States or not?
I know that it's true that a lot of couples do separate after the kids go off, to college, sometimes high school, whatever, because there is, because all you're talking about when you're raising your kids is your kids. Even when you're not with your kids, you're talking about your kids. And then suddenly you are no longer talking about the kids as much, but you're kind of reestablishing, as you said, that relationship, but when it was just the two of you, which was a very long time ago. Mm. So personally, that didn't happen, no. But I can see how that would be really difficult for people, to come to terms with that. And you turn around and say, shit, who's this? What a fucking arsehole. I was too busy to notice. I'm sure that happens,
So when you hear sort of like, you get a lot of sort of classic stories of, and I've had conversations, with guys that I know that are going through divorces, and they're like, my wife's taking half of everything I've earned, and she's got the kids, and I've still got to pay, mate. Does it to give you any more sympathy towards the sort of the stay-at-home husband wife in those circumstances than maybe you had previously before?
I think it's, it goes back to the lack of comprehension as to what the stay-at-home parent is doing and has done. And it's not as if there should be endless gratitude until they're dead. You don't want the spouse to be thanking you profusely, because after all, the best kids are raised by two parents anyway. They're not just raised by one. Well, that came out wrong. It's not that single parent is bad or anything, but it's much easier to do it with two parents that really care. It's much, much easier. But when you think about when you have parents who both have careers and they choose to stay at work and continue their careers, oftentimes they'll hire the cheapest nanny they can get. And I remember I had a friend who was working, and his wife was working, and they were so excited because they got this nanny who was cheaper than anybody else they'd interviewed, and they just hired her. So it's like as if that's the kind of focus. It just seems crazy to me. I used to take the kids to the park all the time, of course, like most parents do after school, and it would be me and a couple of mums and like 100 nannies, because New York City is very career orientated and the rest of it. But most of the nannies are sitting there on the phone. The kids are like falling off the slides and going the wrong way up the swing. Nannies are just sitting there like gossiping, and I'm like 3 inches behind my kids at all times, and just paying attention. And I think the thought process behind having children has changed. First of all, because we're having children a lot later than our parents did. That's a very important thing to take into account. If we're not wiser, we have a lot more experience than our parents did. But I think also the attitude towards kids now is very focused on the kids. And for our parents, it wasn't. Kids were like just a matter of course, something you had, like a fridge.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or something you did once you got married, have a bunch of kids. It's very different for us, because also when you're older, you typically are a bit better off financially than you would have been at, say, 21, 22. And it's easier in that sense. But I think we put a lot more focus on our kids' welfare than our parents did. And that's a good thing, of course. The lack of comprehension, if I get back to that for a minute, is not to say that the spouse who's working doesn't care to understand. But I think from my perspective, I changed completely with the kids. It changed my worldview. I was suddenly more compassionate, suddenly interested in other people's kids, which I never even noticed that other people had kids before. um, and, it was just small things like I'd wake up if somebody breathed wrong. Because when you're doing the feeding during the night, if you remember those days, you're listening for your son or your daughter to wake up, and you leap out of bed and you feed them and change the nappy and all that. But still to this day, I really like sleeping before the kids sleep through a hurricane. My sleep is terrible because the slightest thing wakes me up. The dog moves and I wake up. It changed me as a person. Having the kids, you develop a love that you've never experienced in your life, and that, I think, changes your whole perspective on the world.
Yeah,
That does sound a bit grandiose, doesn't it?
no, I agree with you. I know that feeling of, when I had Zach, it was that feeling of experiencing a completely unconditional love. And then for me, it changed my view of relationships as well, because I wanted it to get, once you know that you can love something that much, you kind of want to get as close. For me, I wanted to get as close as I could to that with someone else. But that's very hard
Yeah.
to replicate outside of your kids. So in terms of, like, you've been married now, you've been married over 30 years? 23. So if you could give people a
23
couple,
years.
like, because I've asked a couple of the guys this before that I've had on, like, from a male point of view, what would be your couple of keys that you would say to a successful long relationship?
I think all relationships are totally different. And, you have to respect each other. You have to respect the person's failings as well as their successes, and not to try to force your perspective on that person, or to force your ideas on that person if they think quite differently about things. Basic things. Compromise is a basic thing, of course. I mean, to be honest with you, because the kids are so important, the years just fly. And then you turn around one day and they are, and it's very difficult to say what is the one or what are the one or two things that make a successful marriage. But I really think the most important thing is to respect each other's differences.
Do you think your own upbringing has a big influence on how you raise your kids? So for us, for instance, we lost our dad really early. We had a single parent. We was brought up by a single parent. But do you think things of your experience growing up have a big influence on then how you parent your own kids?
Yeah, 100%. 100%. I think a part of that as well was because our dad died. He was only 38, and I was very conscious that I wanted the years that we have together. If I was going to go about the same time, not to be too sort of morbid, then I wanted them to have memories of me being around all the time.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that you spoil them, but just that you're there. You're just always there. You're there when they come home. That's a really important thing. A psychotherapist told me once, with regard to kids, if the kids are having a tough time, there's not a lot you can do, but you can be there. And that's...
So last question, mate, because we're running out of time. So if you could grow up again, would you rather grow up in the time that you dominantly, or grow up now, have that time now?
No, I'd hate to grow up now. I would hate it.
Really?
It's awful. Oh, yeah. The world's horrible now. I mean, it was horrible then, but we didn't know. We didn't know it was horrible. We didn't have computers. We had no idea what was going on in France. And now you can find out what's going on all over the world. It's terrible. It's a terrible time to grow up. I feel sorry for kids growing up now. I think it was obviously, every time was always more innocent. It was always better when somebody else grew up, when our parents grew up, our grandparents grew up. But I think we were very fortunate in the era where we grew up. Was, and a lot of that is down to genetics and accident of birth and where you grow up and all the rest of it. But, in spite of the fact we really didn't have a lot as kids, it was a pretty decent time to be a kid, I thought.
Yeah.
and you had a lot more freedom. You know, there weren't like rapists in every corner. I mean, flashes. I saw, what, does he want to tell me something? I didn't know what he was doing. And I thought, because I was like 9 years old, and I thought, oh, that must be the flasher. That's what he does. I didn't know what a flasher was. So anyway, so I ran in, and my mum was in the kitchen. I said, Mum, I think I just saw the flasher. And she said, oh, just ignore him. Don't call the police. Don't go see if he's still there. Don't send the neighbour after him. Just ignore him. He'll go away.
But that was sort of that time, though, wasn't it? Of so many things, I think.
Yeah. That was that time.
It was funny, actually, because I was talking. I did a podcast a couple of weeks ago about menopause, which is really great. If you haven't seen it, go on there and watch. But when I was speaking to when I was speaking to Mum about it, she kind of said that she didn't have a menopause at all. She said because she was B2 or something like that, but she said she didn't experience any symptoms at all. But actually, when I spoke to Kate, which was who I did the podcast with, she said a lot of women at that time, because it was just a kind of an era of like, just get on with it. It was all the symptoms that they had, they sort of just got on with it. So there wasn't that understanding of what it is and what effects it has on you. And then she said when she did it with her mum and looked back, that was a time when she then got divorced from her husband and all these other things happened. So I think it was an era of where, like you say, people just ignore it, just get on with it. And I think that was the way for a lot of things and subjects.
Yeah, everything in that period was swept under the rug. Everything, but especially emotions.
Yeah,
nobody was allowed to show any emotions.
Yeah.
You know, and it was a very private time, and I think the access of the internet, along with others, really changed that. So that we're able to read about everybody's slightest inclination, everybody's feelings all the time is on every tabloid, on every laptop. And it's sort of desensitized a bit, you know, whereas in the period when we grew up, like, you didn't know anything about anybody. You're like, geez, I didn't know he was a murderer. Oh, yeah. He murdered several people. He's been in prison now, you know. He's such a nice milkman. You know, that was different. I think also, just on a very sort of superficial note, the music that we grew up with, that period was the absolute best. The absolute best for a teenager to grow up in the 70s and 80s. That was the best music, I think.
Well, listen, Bud, I did just thank you for coming. I hope you found it for yourself. I hope you've enjoyed it. For you guys watching, I hope it's been interesting just to hear a male point of view on what is a very female-based sort of area, usually of motherhood. Listening to someone from a male side, giving their perspective on it. So, hope you've all enjoyed it. Thanks for coming on, Bud. And don't forget, subscribe below and let me know your comments. And we'll see you soon on Fifth Chosen Grey.